Now, no matter how long your video game history has been, as you pass through time, of course you're going to come across games that you can quite simply call game changers. In other words, games that open your eyes to new experiences and new ways to play games. And over the course of my almost 50 years of video game history, well, I have faced a few game changers in my time, and of course, for your pleasure, I'm going to show you the top 10 game changers from my almost 50 years of video games. Coming right up after these. Now, of course, I'm going to do this in chronological order, so we'll be starting with the earliest game changer, the very first game that changed the way I video gamed, and move on to the very latest one. Where else to start as a 50-year-old man than with this? This is a Pong clone. Now, for anyone who doesn't know Pong, where have you been? And why are you watching this channel? Because Pong was probably, without a shadow of a doubt, the very first game changer for absolutely everyone on the planet. Because very simply, it was the very first game that was an actual game changer. Because before Pong, nobody really played video games. Well, not outside of university and college science labs and other technical institutes. Now, yes, I know a lot of people will be saying, what about the Magnavox Odyssey? Well, yes and no, because there was a Pong type game on that anyway, but that was more of an interactive television entertainment system than an actual video game, a video game that we would know and recognise today. What Pong brought to the table was a two-player social event that could be played in your home and was ultra competitive because it had a scoring system too. And back in 1977, when my good old dad brought me one of these into the home and put that paddle into my hand for the first time, well, that was the ultimate in game changers, because until then I hadn't even played a video game, probably hadn't even heard the term. No, I wouldn't have heard the term because they tended to be called either TV games or computer games back then. So Pong, without a doubt, is the first game changer that I ever experienced, because it introduced me to video games, as I'm sure it has a lot of you out there too. Coming in at number 2 is technically what you could call the first game changer that I experienced, because it was the first time I was changing from one form of video game to another, and that game came along in 1978 and in 1979 and 1980 when I properly was introduced to it myself. That game was Space Invaders. Now, Space Invaders was absolutely like nothing else that I had ever experienced before. Sure, playing Pong at home had its moments, but when you're introduced to your very first arcade cab, let me tell you, that's a special moment indeed. And when we're talking about the game that actually changed the whole landscape when it came to video game arcades, well, I consider myself very lucky that it was Space Invaders that introduced me to the arcade scene. Now, for me, the very first time I experienced Space Invaders was in my local chippy. Now, for anyone living outside the UK who has never come across the term chippy before, well, it's simply this: chippies are takeaway fried food vendors. And yes, arcade machines were one of the things that they did put into their restaurants just to entice people in. Now, I have no idea if this was common practice across the globes. For example, if you're watching this from America, did McDonald's or Burger King have arcades in their restaurants? And if so or not, let me know down in the comments. But Space Invaders, I was introduced to this game in a chippy, and of course it taught me that I needed more than just Pong from my video game experience. And that's exactly what Space Invaders did. Now, coming in at number 3 is a game that I was late to the party, and it was on a system that I was late to the party on, and that game is Missile Command. And why was it a game changer? Well, quite simply because this was much more like the arcade experience we were experiencing outside the home, but inside the home. And let's be honest folks, that's exactly what we were looking for back in the late 70s and early 80s. As much as we loved the arcade machines that were starting to hit the market, we really wanted this experience at home without having to throw a metric ton of pocket change at these arcade machines, which were wonderful, but this was the experience we were after: arcade fun in the home. Now, of course, it didn't quite live up to the arcade machines because of the quality of the hardware, but in 1981 it was certainly enough to sate my appetite. So Missile Command was yet another game changer because it brought me back out of the arcades and back into the home, where we all really want to game the most. Coming in at number 4 is a game that probably not a lot of you out there have played or probably even heard of, because that game is Orbiter on the ZX Spectrum. Now, despite my many pleas to my parents to acquire for me an Atari 2600 on Christmas 1982, instead of that I received a ZX Spectrum. Now, of course, I was a bit disappointed not getting the Atari for Christmas in 1982, but it wasn't long before that all changed, and that's because Orbiter here was an absolute game changer. The particular arcade at the time that was taking up all of my time and most of my money was Defender, and Orbiter here is, as you can see, a Defender clone. And although there's not a great deal of difference between the ZX Spectrum graphics and definitely sound compared to the Atari 2600, it certainly did edge it out when it came to price point, especially for the games. Atari cartridges back in the day would cost you an absolute arm and leg. It's something that you couldn't pick up with your pocket money, but a ZX Spectrum cassette game, that was very much in the reach of your weekly pocket money, some games coming in as low as £1.99. And of course, being a microcomputer, there was many more things you could do with the ZX Spectrum. But once Orbiter was on, then you couldn't drag me off that machine for love nor money, and that's why Orbiter is a game changer for me. Now, as time moves forward and technology becomes outdated, well, the poor ZX Spectrum really couldn't keep up with the arcades, and that's where I ended up spending most of my time as we approached the 90s. But little did I know that another game-changing game was coming along in 1991 in the form of a little Swede blue hedgehog, and that game is Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, of course, I don't need to talk too much about Sonic the Hedgehog because we're starting to get into the territory where most people will know the games that I'm talking about. And why was it a game changer for me? Well, it's just like I said, the ZX Spectrum was becoming outdated. It couldn't keep up with the arcades. I mean, it didn't really emulate the arcades that well to start with, but by the time we got into the 1990s, the ZX Spectrum just didn't have the punching power to match the arcades and the thrills that we're looking for in video games. Now, of course, there were other consoles out there at the time of the ZX Spectrum, such as the NES and the Master System, but they were systems that had very little involvement with, and mainly because the differences between the 8-bit microcomputers and the 8-bit consoles wasn't that great. I didn't need to invest any time or money into those cartridge systems. But when you sit down for the very first time in 1991 and you see this little blue blur fly across the screen, well, you had no option but to stand up and take notice, and that's exactly what Sonic the Hedgehog did. It showed once again that home video games could at least try and keep up there with the arcade machines of the time and save you an absolute fortune in pocket change, because that's what you had to fire into the arcade cabs. Because at home, once you had the game, of course, you could play it for free and over and over and over again. And with a game with the quality of Sonic the Hedgehog, well, you were more than happy to do so. So this little blue blur of a hedgehog was definitely a game-changing game for me, because it brought me again back out of the arcades and back into home gaming. Now, moving on to game-changing video game number 6, we have to take account of the time that we're set in at the moment, and that is the early 1990s. And in the 1990s, there was a lot of avenues for you to choose for your gaming entertainment. Now, as the previous game does highlight, I did go down the Sega Mega Drive route, but at that time I was also gaming on PCs, early IBM compatible PCs, and of course the arcade was still king. I did of course turn 20 years of age in 1993 and was starting to feel like I was growing up a bit. Don't get me wrong, it didn't take me away from video games, but I was craving something else, and that something else came along in 1996, and the game was Resident Evil on the PlayStation. Now, why was Resident Evil such a game changer for me? Well, I would imagine a lot of you out there who experienced Resident Evil when it came out will have pretty much the same opinion. Now, as I said, in the early to mid 1990s there was an explosion of video game avenues that you could explore. PCs, consoles, arcades, you name it, there was ways to play games. But when it came to home gaming, the Sony PlayStation had an absolute ace up its sleeve when it came to Resident Evil in 1996. Yes, you could play similar such games on PC, but that was a costly endeavour, having to buy not only the hardware to have a PC, but the hardware to run the games that you wanted to run on it. What Sony managed to deliver was PC quality gaming in console form. All you had to do was plug in your PlayStation, throw in the Resident Evil disc, and away you went with one of the most quality gaming experiences you could have at the time. Now, I'm not going to talk about the game in general, because this is more about why the game was a game changer. PC quality graphics and CD quality sound in one convenient package that you never had to upgrade. And that was exactly why. So Resident Evil, definitely a game changing video game, and it certainly was for me, and I'm sure a lot of you out there, it was a game changer for you too. Now, game number 7, and that's quite an apt number, and because I've just said that, I'm sure you're going to work out yourself what this particular game was, and it was a game that came out in 1997, so the 7s are quite rampant here, triple 7s so far, and that game, Final Fantasy VII. Now, why was Final Fantasy VII a game-changing video game for me? Well, that was quite simple. No, it was nothing to do with the Sony PlayStation itself. It wasn't a change from PC or arcade to console gaming again. It was quite simply the first time that I'd actually and properly experienced a little-known genre by the name of JRPG. Now, I'm sure you all know what a JRPG is, a Japanese role-playing game. Now, of course, this wasn't the first JRPG that I had ever experienced on the Master System. There was Fantasy Star, and yes, I did manage to see some of that gameplay back in the day and play just a little bit of it. I do, however, feel that I was probably just a little bit young to properly appreciate that game at that time. But Final Fantasy VII, oh my, this really did open my eyes to JRPGs in a very big way. And as much as the games in this list have been taking us from maybe one console to another console, back to the arcades or back into the home, well, Final Fantasy VII was no change in console and no change in venue, it was a change in the way that I played games. It pulled me totally away from the arcade style of gaming, one-on-one fighters, beat-em-ups and shoot-em-ups, and focused my sole passion onto this new style of gaming that I had just discovered. Now, on top of that, Final Fantasy VII is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time, and in my humble opinion, it's definitely up there. It's at number 1, number 2 with Suikoden 2, but that's a whole different game and a whole different story. Well, not really. It's a JRPG, and it's because of Final Fantasy VII changing my game, or changing the way I played games, that I moved on to so many other games like that in the future. So Final Fantasy VII, definitely a game changer, and definitely a game changer for me. Now, moving on to video game changer number 8, we're moving a couple of consoles ahead, because although the 6th generation of consoles was fantastic with the PlayStation 2 in my particular case, there wasn't a great deal of game changing moments that came along with the PlayStation 2, not experiences that were new to me that it really dragged me into something different. But when it came to the PlayStation 3, there was one particular game advertised that absolutely captivated me, and it did change the way that I played games for quite a while, because that particular game, at number 8, Assassin's Creed. Now, I'm sure many of you out there will remember that when the PlayStation 3 launched, it launched with a very hefty price tag, and despite being a Sony pony from 1996, the price tag did in fact scare me off just ever so slightly. However, when advertisements for Assassin's Creed began to show on TV, then that absolutely changed my mind about forking out and getting that particular system. Now, of course, many of you will know and agree that the game itself is pretty much a tech demo. Now, yes, there's a fully working video game in there, but it's very bare bones. But what Assassin's Creed managed to do was show the early power of the PlayStation 3, and making that jump from the PlayStation 2 quality of graphics to the PlayStation 3 quality, well, that was probably the last time that I can recall an actual jump in quality that seemed worth the upgrade. Now, of course, it wasn't just the graphics, although they did have a huge part in drawing me into Assassin's Creed, but the scope of the gameplay that the PlayStation 3 and of course the rest of the 8th generation consoles could deliver. Assassin's Creed just happened to be the one that drew me in and changed the way I gamed, because for the first time in a long time, I'd started drifting away from solely and exclusively playing JRPGs and put a little bit more action adventure back into my gameplay. And yes, I'll say it again that nowadays this game seems like nothing more than a tech demo, but if you play the other Assassin's Creed games, you can see the quality that we were heading for buried deep in this, or not that deep anyway, but still buried in this. So Assassin's Creed, definitely a game changer for me. Now, for video game changer number 9 for me, we're staying with the PlayStation 3, because that was a fantastic generation of consoles, but it was another genre that I discovered during that particular generation that really made me change the way that I gamed. Because the game at number 9 is Fallout 3. And why was it a game changer, I hear you ask? Well, that's quite simple. This is a Western RPG, or a WRPG if you must, and it was the very first time that I'd played a Western RPG. Now, of course, it does help that the music in this game is absolutely phenomenal. The graphics were definitely a step up from what we were used to on the JRPGs on the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, but action RPG was something that I'd never really played before, and one of the biggest reasons for that was that I always assumed that you had to play these games in first person. Discovering, however, that you could play this in first or third person, well, that was completely game changing for me, and not only that, it opened my eyes to the Western role-playing games that came after it that have sucked up almost as much time as my beloved JRPGs have in the past. So yes, Fallout 3, an absolute game changer for me, and I was absolutely delighted to discover this game when I did. Fallout 3. So here we are at video game changer number 10, and we're all the way to modern time for this one. because it's Yakuza Like a Dragon. So now I can imagine you asking why Like a Dragon on the PlayStation 4 is such a game changer. Because obviously you're thinking to yourself, it's a Sony console, you're gaming in the home, and it's a JRPG. Well, yes to all of the above, but what you have to remember is that over the last few years the turn-based combat in JRPGs has fallen out of favour. But thanks to Yakuza Like a Dragon and a couple of games out there, turn-based combat is not gone, and it's not gone for good by the looks of things. Yes, the current trend in Final Fantasy, however, has taken away the turn-based combat, but all that has merely done is taken me away from Final Fantasy games as a main staple of what I would love to play and move on to other games that I might not have played otherwise. And yes, Yakuza Like a Dragon is exactly an example of this, and so is Persona 5. So as an honourable mention, Like a Dragon and Persona 5, they changed the way I was gaming because they dragged me away from the mindset that I must play Final Fantasy and forced me off my own beaten path. So Yakuza Like a Dragon was an absolute video game changer for me because it took me away from must play Final Fantasy to let's look for other quality JRPGs that stick to their turn-based roots. So there you go my friends, that's 10 video games that were video game changers for me anyway, ranging all the way from Pong up to Yakuza Like a Dragon. Now this part of the video is all for you. I want you to drop down to the comments and give me one video game that was a game changer for you. One game that took you away from what you were comfortable with, moved you onto something else and gave you something new to love, because the interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. It does for me anyway. Thank you very much for watching as always, and until next time, don't forget to drop a comment and cheerio!